Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Friendly Academy. Now in this video, we are going to discuss about how do we connect to a private API from AWS Lambda. Now I thought of discussing this subject because this is one of the common use cases you may encounter when you start using AWS serverless in your projects. So let's imagine that you have some resources and you don't want people to access them over internet because you're worried that these requests may be vulnerable to internet vulnerabilities such as man-in-the-middle attacks, DDoS, so on and so forth. And probably these resources may contain some sensitive information. So in such a cases, you expose them over an API gateway. And this API gateway is a private API. But still again, you want your Lambda functions to access these private APIs. And that's the use case we are going to discuss in this video. So let's get started. Okay, now if you have an API, and let's say that's a public API. So if you have this public API gateway API, and your Lambda function can access them over internet, because this public API has its publicly routable DNS, and you can use internet to connect to it. And you don't want your Lambdas to be in a VPC. You can just create a Lambda function and use any client library to connect to your API and then use it. So this is the most straightforward one. Now in this case, just one thing you should remember is that Lambdas are always spun up in AWS Lambda Service VPC. So regardless whether you have VPC configuration or not, always Lambdas are getting spun up in Lambda Service VPCs. So in this case also, we have our Lambda function in Lambda Service VPC and it's connecting over its internet gateways and so on over the internet and then talk to your the public API. So what if your Lambda function also wants to connect with your VPC resources? For example, let's say that we have an EC2 instance, right? And this EC2 instance in our VPC. So this is our VPC. Or customer VPC, right? And if you want to access this EC2 instance, and let's say this EC2 instance in a private subnet, so Lambda still want to access this as well. Now this is the time that you configure your VPC configuration of your VPC with AWS Lambda. So when you configure that, AWS Lambda is going to attach an ENI. So this is that ENI into your VPC, particularly on your subnet, so that AWS Lambda can connect to your VPC and then gain access to the EC2 machine. And this creation of ENI happens automatically. So whenever you configure your VPC settings of your VPC with AWS Lambda function, this thing happens. This is automatic. So one thing to remember here is that when you configure VPC configuration, that doesn't mean the Lambda functions are getting invoked in the VPC. Rather, there will be an ENI created for it, and then Lambda connect to your resources in your VPC through that ENI. And this process happens automatically. You don't have to worry about that, and you're not being charged for this ENI as well. But however, let's imagine you want to connect to a private API. Now, public API we discussed, so Lambdas can access over internet. That's fine. But if you want to connect to a private API, how can we facilitate that? So our Lambda wants to connect to this private API. Now, in this case, private APIs are also not spin up within your VPC. So it's not inside your VPC. So this is inside this AWS API Gateway Service. So they may have their own VPCs and all that. So this is another instance that you would need another ENI. So this is that ENI, and this ENI, Elastic Network Interface, will give access to this private API over AWS Backbone. But this time, unlike the automatic creation of this ENI for AWS Lambda function, it won't get automatically created for you. So you have to create this ENI. And in order to create this ENI, you can use VPC endpoint. So you can go to AWS VPC service and create a VPC endpoint, particularly an interface endpoint. And then you can choose API gateway when you are selecting the service that you want to connect to. And after that, an ENI will be created for that subnet that you have requested for. So with that, any resource in this particular VPC have a way of connecting to this private API through this ENI. Alright, so our intention is for AWS Lambda function to connect to this private API. So how do we do this? So we already have an ENI for AWS Lambda, right? So it is this one. And then we have an ENI for our private API. So here we have to allow this path such that Lambda function will access VPC, your VPC through this ENI, and from this ENI you will be able to access this API gateway ENI, and through that you will connect to this private API gateway. One common way that we do this is by using security groups. So you have a security group attached to your Lambda function, right? So when you attach a security group to your Lambda function, that is essentially getting attached to the ENI. Now similarly, for our API gateway endpoint also, we can define a security group. So we have a security group attached to this ENI that's connecting to this private API, and security group attached to our Lambda ENI as well. Then we can define an inbound rule to our security group number 2, which is associated with the private API gateway, to allow inbound access from any resources attached this security group number 1. So we have Lambda function ENI that has this security group attached. Any request from this Lambda, it will accept it and it will send it to the private API gateway. And similarly, you can define an outbound rule to this particular security group. The security group is attached to the ENI of the Lambda, and this outbound rule says allow traffic to any resources that has this security group 2 attached. So that way we are allowing the outbound traffic of Lambda to this ENI, and also this particular security group allowing inbound traffic from AWS Lambda. So that way the networking completes, and now it's trying to connect to API gateway. But in addition to that, we also have to configure a resource policy at the API gateway level as well. Now this is the resource policy that determines who can connect this private API. So in this resource policy, we can say only this particular VPC endpoint can connect to me. So here you will add this VPC endpoint ID in the resource policy. So any request or any traffic coming from this particular endpoint will be allowed. Or else you can also attach this entire VPC ID as well. So that way, if you have multiple ENIs in this particular VPC, they will also be allowed to access this private API. So if you are still unclear about this whole setup, let's go ahead with the implementation and also come back to this time to time. By the way, if you are not familiar about this VPC, subnet, security group, so on and so forth, I have a crash course in this channel. I will put that link in the description as well. You can watch that first, because in that crash course I cover all the basics for AWS networking. Alright, so I'm in AWS console. So first, let's go ahead and create a VPC. So we are going to create this VPC and we'll call this my VPC. So I will go to VPC here, or I can just search your VPC. And I'm going to click create VPC. So you can choose VPC only option or VPC and more. I think VPC and more gives you a nice wizard. So this is the default. So you can give it a name. So I can call it my VPC. So we have this my VPC, and then we have to define a CIDR block. So here I'm using 10.0.0/16. So I have this many IP addresses. By the way, if you are not familiar about CIDR block, subnets, so on and so forth, I have a crash course, as I earlier mentioned. You can check that link in the description. And the tenancy, I will use the default tenancy. Availability zones, so this VPC spans across 2 availability zones, and then number of public subnets. So here by default they are setting 2 public subnets. So as you can see in this visual graph, so this VPC has 1 and 2, 2 public subnets, subnet public 1, subnet public 2, and 2 private subnets, subnet private 1, subnet private 2. But here in this case, I'll select 0 public subnets, and I only have 2 private subnets. So that is private subnet 1 and private subnet 2. And each private subnet is connected to its own route table. So private subnet 1 connected to route table private subnet 1, and this one route table private subnet 2. And if you scroll down, there are no any NAT gateways, because anyway NAT gateways needs to be in a public subnet. Since we don't have public subnet, no NAT gateways. VPC endpoints, so they are creating a S3 gateway. Look, this is S3 gateway endpoints created, but we don't want that, so let's select none. So this is our setup. So I just have VPC, and it has 2 subnets, private, both are private subnets, and then each connected to its own route table, and there are no any network connections, no any VPC endpoints or anything created for that. And most importantly, I will enable these 2 options, enable DNS host names and enable DNS resolution. Make sure you turn them on, and then I'll click create VPC. So it's gonna take a few seconds. All right, so that is created. So this is my VPC. So my VPC has DNS hostname enabled, DNS resolution enabled, and if I go to subnets and filter my VPC, I will filter my VPC right here. So this is my VPC. So if I filter it, I will see my 2 private subnet, subnet 1, subnet 2. Okay, so we have our VPC with 2 private subnet. Now let's go ahead and create a private API. So here in the search bar, I will search for API gateway, select it. Here I'm going to go ahead and click create API, and I need a REST API. So this is a REST API. I will click build. So here I can create a new API, clone exist one, import one, or example API. So let's use an example API, and that is going to give me this pet store API, where I can get details of the pets by calling /pets, and it has some other methods as well. /pets, that will give you all the list of pets. And then, so this is the important part, endpoint type. So there are 3 types of endpoints: regional endpoints, edge optimized, and private. So in our case, it's gonna be a private endpoint. So here you can see in the note, private APIs are only accessible through VPC endpoints for gateway. So we have to create a VPC endpoint, and then you have to select that VPC endpoint ID, but we don't have a VPC endpoint yet. So let's go ahead and click this link, and that will take us to VPC endpoint console. Here we go. So it has automatically selected these endpoints. If you don't see that note section, just go to AWS VPC, and under virtual private cloud category, you will see these endpoints. So right now I don't have any VPC endpoints. So let's go ahead and create a VPC endpoint, and I will call it API gateway VPC endpoint, because we are going to connect to an API gateway. Remember that? So we are going to connect our VPC endpoint to the API gateway. So this is that API gateway managed service that we are creating an VPC endpoint. So VPC endpoint is going to create an ENI, and through that TNI then we can connect to it. And so I'm going to select the category. So we want to connect to an service, AWS service, and then now we have to select our service. So there are like 249 services. So you can connect to step functions, code pipeline, code build, and many more AWS services through VPC endpoints. So we are interested about API gateway. So you can search for execute API. So this is that service name. So it's a little bit tricky. So in order to identify the correct service, you should know how to search that. So in this case for API gateway, you have to search for execute API. Okay, and you can see the type is interface. So like I mentioned, there is this interface endpoints and gateway endpoints. So gateway endpoints are only for S3 and DynamoDB. So now we are creating an VPC endpoint interface type to access API gateway. So that's this execute API means. And now we need to attach that to a VPC. So we are going to select our newly created my VPC, and then I'm gonna select these two subnets. So these are my private subnets. So this is the availability zone and this is subnet ID. Okay, so I've selected these two subnets so they can use this VPC endpoint. And now I have to provide a security group. Now remember, the VPC endpoint, we can attach a security group. So this is a security group, SG2. So let's go ahead and create a security group now. So leave this page open and I will just search for VPC again. And then right click on it, open it in a new tab. So I don't lose this information in this page. So I go here under VPC, or rather security, we have security groups. So click on that and I'm gonna go ahead and create a new security group. So let's give it a name, SG2, the same one. I'm copying the same name I have given here, SG2. Description the same, and the VPC that I'm attaching it is to my VPC. And so far there are no any inbound rules. Outbound rules, I will delete it for now. So let's configure outbound rule once we set up the other VPC, other security group as well. And that's it. Let's go ahead and create the security group. Alright, so it is created. I go back to my previous tab and then do a refresh. Then I should see that SG2 security group. So let me select that one. And I will provide full access. That would be it. And then I'm going to go ahead and create the endpoint. So the endpoint creation has successfully started. So if you scroll right, you can see the status is pending. Let's refresh it. It should take few minutes to complete. So far we've created the VPC, two subnets, and VPC endpoint. This one that's connecting to private API, and also a security group attached to that. And I have also created a private API as well. And now we want to resume creating our API gateway private API, because we stopped in the middle right here because it's asking for a VPC endpoint. So we went ahead and created a VPC endpoint. So let's see if our endpoint is succeeded. So let me refresh this one more time. And now it's available. So now we can use it. So let's go to our API gateway console where we left off. So let me see. It doesn't give me the refresh button. That's sad. So I just have to refresh it, but it's okay. Yeah, so let me quickly select it, example API, and then private. Okay, here we go. So this is our new API VPC endpoint. So I'll select that, and that would be it. So I'm going to go ahead and create the API. So let me click create API. All right. So our API is created and it has some default paths /pets to get all the pets, and we can create pets, I believe, here, and also I can take or get a specific pet with his pet ID. All right. So we have created a private API as well. And now we need to create a resource policy, because this resource policy is required to allow access to this particular private API. So we are going to allow access to our VPC endpoint ID. So let me go to my API gateway, and here I will select resource policy. Right now there are no any resource policy. I'm going to go ahead and click create resource policy. Let's see if I have a template. Yes, source VPC allow list template. So let me select that, and now I can do some edits here. So there are two statements. One is the deny statement, the other one is allow statement. So it's going to deny anything, any principal that is trying to connect to it if this condition matches. So what is this condition? If the string not equals to source VPC, whatever the VPC ID. So if it is not originated from this particular VPC, it's going to reject it. So let's do a small change here. Instead of VPC, I want to check whether this is originated by the VPC endpoint. So here only thing, I just have to append an E here. So VPC E, so this indicate VPC endpoint. So here I have to add the VPC endpoint ID. Let me remove this one, and I'll go to my endpoints, and I should see my VPC endpoint ID, or I can just click here and copy it right there, paste it. That's it. And then let's add some wildcard to this as well. The stage name, for any stage we are requesting for traffic originated from this, for any HTTP method, get post, we will do the same, and also for any resource path. So we add like 3 wildcard, but you can define your policies in much more granular way. But here we are defining with wildcards. And then we are also updating this as well. So this is our allow list. So here we are explicitly allowing any traffic originated by the VPC endpoint as well. That should do. And I'm going to go ahead and click save changes. Okay, my policy is updated, and there's important information here. After you update the resource policy, you have to deploy our API. So we haven't deployed our API even at once, right? So let's go to our resources. So this is our API, and then I'm going to go ahead and deploy it. So I don't have a stage, and I'll call it this is dev stage, and then deploy. All right. So we've added a resource policy as well. So we have an API gateway, resource policy, ENI, and the security group for the ENI. Now we have to create our Lambda function. So let's go ahead and create a Lambda function. All right. So I'm in AWS Lambda, and I'm go ahead and create a function. So I click create function, and let's author one from scratch. Let's say my Lambda function, and using Node.js 20x runtime, I'll use ARM64. And then under the advanced settings, I'm going to enable VPC. So this is the place where we select our VPC, which is my VPC. And then I'm going to have to select the subnets. So we have 2 subnets. So I'm going to select both the subnets. And then I need to create or select the security group as well. So what we are right now configuring is these parts. So we have created the Lambda function, and then now we are connecting this VPC with an ENI. So this ENI is automatically created, but we have to provide the VPC information here. So we have to create this security group as well, which will be attached to the ENI after it's created. So let's go ahead and select or create a new security group. And this time I'm going to call it SG2. SG2. oh sorry, SG1, because our security group name is SG1. And I'll just add the same here. And the VPC I'm attaching is this VPC, my VPC. Let's remove inbound, outbound rules for now and then create it. SG1 is created, and here in the Lambda console, I'm gonna refresh it. I should see both SG1 and SG2. So here I'm gonna select SG1. And then I'll go ahead and click create function. So it can take few minutes because when we connect our VPC to a Lambda function, it needs to create this ENI, and it's doing it automatically for us. By the way, while it is being created, let's go ahead and update the code. So right now I have this handler function, which is doing nothing but printing hello world. So I'll remove this one and I'm going to paste in a code. So let's quickly go over it. So it's using HTTPS module from HTTPS. So we can use this module to connect to an API or make an HTTP request. So in get make or make get request, we have to add the host name and the path and the method. So in this case, we are calling get method and the path the dev/pets. So it's going to return me all the pets, and then host name is API gateway host name. So let's go to our API gateway and I'll quickly show you how to find this information. So let me open it in a new tab, and this is the API we created, pet store. And if you go to its dashboards, you should find this invoke URL. So you can just take a copy of it and then grab the first part. This is the prefix, and that's what I'm going to replace this prefix with. The rest is the same. So this is the prefix, DNS prefix of your API, and the execute api.useast1.amazonaws.com. Don't worry, I put this in a gist and put it in the description section. You can just copy that from there. Okay, so path is all good. And here I'm collecting the information from the API call, and this is my main handler function. So what does this main handler function do? It first make the get request, and once it got the data, it's gonna send us request successful message. All right, so let's go ahead and deploy the changes because we updated the Lambda code. So let's deploy it, and now let's go ahead and test it. So I'll click test and let's create a test event, test. All right, so let's click test again. That will run an execution. There you go, I got an error. It's a 500 internal error, and the error is get address info endpoint not found. So it's unable to find this endpoint. Why is that? Now this is a private endpoint, but shouldn't it be able to identify it through VPC endpoint? So let's see. Now we have all these setup created. So we have an ENI automatically created for Lambda, ENI that we created for the VPC endpoint, but we haven't done this, plumbing, right? So we have this security group as well. So we need to allow outbound from SG1 to SG2 and inbound from whatever the resources from SG1 into SG2. So let's do that. Okay, so first let me go to my Lambda. So this is my Lambda, and I'll go to configuration, and then I go to this VPC tab. So let me select that, and then I will copy this security group ID. So this is the SG1 ID. So let me just copy this one. So I put it in online notepad. This is SG1. So let's get the other security group ID as well. I search for VPC and open it in a new tab. Go to security groups. Let's get this SG2 ID as well. So this is the SG2. See this one? And this is the security group ID. Paste here. This is SG2. Okay, now let's go ahead and update the inbound and outbound rules. So start with SG2. So SG2 is our VPC endpoint security group. So it needs to allow inbound requests from any resource where this security group is attached. So let's do that. I will go to the security section. So this is my SG2. I'll click on it, and inbound rules section. I'm going to click edit inbound rules, add a rule. I will allow all traffic from the security group of SG1. So what is that SG1 security group? It is this one. So here I will just paste it. Now I can select it from the list. So there's only one. Okay. I'll go ahead and save the rules. So the first security group, or the security group 2, is now updated. So let's update security group 1 as well. So this is security group 1. And click outbound rules. Because, so this is the security group we want to output all the traffic. So our VPC interface endpoint will be able to forward those requests to private API. So in the outbound section, similarly, I will go click edit outbound rules, add a rule, and it's going to be all TCP. And then we have to select the security group 2 security group ID. So let me select that one, and I'm gonna paste it here. As you can see, I can just select the security group 2 from the drop down. That would be it. So let me save the rules. Okay, now we have everything set up. Lambda is there, and ENIs, 2 ENIs, security groups, and the private API and the resource policy. So let's test it again, shall we? So this is my Lambda function that got failed earlier. Let's do another test. So I'll click on it. I still get this, so let's test it for a couple of times. Oh, by the way, I just noticed. So this is referencing the US East 1, but right now I am on US West 2. So let me just replace that one. Probably that's the issue. So let me just paste it here and then deploy. All right, it is deployed. And then I'll go ahead and test again. Great. Now I receive all the pets. Did you see? So I got these 3 pets: dog, cat, and fish. So that means our setup is working. So let's try to block any inbound traffic to this particular security group. So if it is not working, then we definitely know the traffic is going from Lambda ENI and coming into this VPC endpoint ENI or security group. So let's do that. So I'll go to security group 2. So SG2, and I have this inbound rule. Let me just change it. Let me just take copy first, and then I will delete it. Save rules. Okay, so it is saved. So let's try again. So I'm gonna go ahead and click test. Now I get a task timeout error. So it's not working, and let me update the security group again. Add rules, all traffic from this security group 1. Save rules, and let me test again. There you go. I got my records. Now this is what I want to show you guys. But before we wind up, if you have been following along, it's better that you go ahead and remove the VPC endpoint. Because VPC endpoint that we create is getting charged for each hour. So there's this hourly charge. So let me go to endpoints and then select this endpoint and click actions and delete VPC endpoint. So make sure you do that to avoid any unnecessary costs. Alright guys, so this is what I want to show you. I hope this has been informative. I'll see you in another video. Thanks.